So recently, GitHub received a DMCA takedown notice for YouTube DL that we're looking at right now, and this was filed by the RIAA, the Recording Industry Association of America, who is a US-based music industry trade organization whose members are in control of most of the Vevo channels. Now, some of the Vevo channels do exist outside of the US, but most of the ones in the US are under this banner, and they claim to be responsible for 85% of the music produced and distributed inside of the US, and this includes major artists like Kanye West and Taylor Swift. So it's not like this is a small organization or anything like that. They are a very big and very powerful organization. So basically what happened is, when GitHub received this takedown notice, they removed 18 repos that contained YouTube DL. So all of these ones here, including the main repo. Now you might be thinking, how is this a DMCA takedown notice? It's not like the RIAA actually owns YouTube DL like you'd see on YouTube and Twitch. People get DMCA takedown notices. Well, it's not like that's the only thing that DMCA can be used for. The Digital Millennium Copyright Act is far, far more wide-reaching than a lot of people seem to understand. So they're not claiming that they actually own YouTube DL. What they're claiming is that YouTube DL is a tool that allows you to actually violate their copyright. So it is a DRM circumvention tool. So in their words, this is an anti-circumvention violation. We also note that the provision of trafficking of the source code violates 17 USC 1201A and 1201B. The source code is a technology primarily designed or produced for the purpose of and marketed for circumventing a technological measure that effectively controls access to copyrighted sound recordings on YouTube, including copyrighted sound recordings owned by our members. Now you might be thinking, DRM circumvention, what DRM does YouTube make use of? Well, they actually do have a DRM system, and this is actually used on every single one of their videos, but it is laughably insecure that any reasonable person would not call it DRM. So basically, YouTube makes use of something called a rolling cipher, which is mentioned right here. Now, a rolling cipher might sound secure. It's not secure at all. Literally, a child could break this DRM. So you probably know that every single YouTube video is assigned a random string that points to the actual web page. So this ID up here is the ID of the video, but this ID doesn't actually point to the video file. It just points to this web page. So when this web page is loaded up, basically a second URL is generated, and this URL is the one that actually points to the video file. And this is basically generated through a complex, constantly changing algorithm, and this algorithm is called the rolling cipher. But the interesting thing about this second URL is that this URL, it has no encryption, it is not obfuscated, there is literally zero protection. It is sent to your web browser in plain text. But under US and EU law, having this rolling cipher that generates a second URL is a form of DRM. I know, this sounds laughably dumb, but just follow along with me. So accessing this URL through an unauthorized means, so anything that isn't the YouTube app or the YouTube website, is a form of circumventing YouTube's DRM system, and that's how it falls under an anti-circumvention violation. Now, this insanely weak level of DRM was decided to be DRM in a court case in the Hamburg Regional Court, and basically it describes what's actually happening. So, in their words, as there, the YouTube DL source code available on GitHub, which is the subject of this notice, circumvents YouTube's rolling cipher to gain unauthorized access to copyrighted audio files in violation of YouTube's express terms of service and in plain violation of Section 1201 of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. So this is what happens when you let boomers who have literally no idea how technology works decide laws regarding technology. Now, you might be saying, this couldn't possibly stick. There's no way that this would ever hold up in court. Well, the thing is that the RIAA has basically launched this exact same DMCA takedown notice against another service called YouTube to MP3. And as we're going to see here, basically, they're bringing up the exact same point about the rolling cipher. The second URL is not protected at all. It's not a DRM method. It shouldn't be considered DRM, but because of the way that US and EU law is structured, trying to get at that URL is DRM circumvention. But it doesn't even matter because a group like YouTube DL obviously does not have the money to fight this in court. So because the RIAA is such a massive organization, there's no way that really anyone can actually fight against them. So they can send out DMCA takedown notices like this, and it doesn't matter who's in the right or in the wrong, because they have so much money, they're just going to win anything that actually happens, and anyone who does do anything is basically going to be forced to bow down against them. Now, the rolling cipher isn't the only thing they used in their claim of DRM circumvention, and this is where YouTube DL actually made a massive mistake, and they could have avoided all of this by not doing this altogether. So, in this line right here, the source code is a technology primarily designed or produced for the purpose of and marketed for circumventing a technological measure that effectively controls access to so on and so forth. The point that's important there is the purpose of and marketed for. So in the source code for YouTube DL, they made a massive mistake that basically put a glowing red target on their backs. So in the source code, basically what they did is included examples for downloading copyrighted material. So that was inside of some of their test files. So we also know that the source code prominently includes, as sample uses of the source code, the downloading of copies of our members' copyrighted sound recordings and music videos, as noted in Exhibit A here too. For example, as shown on Exhibit A, the source code expressly suggests its use to copy and or distribute the following copyrighted works owned by our member companies. So we have a Justin Timberlake song, we have a Taylor Swift song, and obviously you don't really want to mess with Sony Music Group or Universal Music Group. So while this still may have been a problem eventually, I don't think the RIAA would have just allowed this to exist in perpetuity. I think that eventually they'd find something to get them on, like with YouTube to MP3, even if they were just called something completely different. By being a tool that allows you to download from YouTube, the RIAA will eventually come after you. But I think that adding in those lines really strengthens the RIAA's claim and makes it much easier for them to actually make this argument. So I think that for most instances, what they could have done is just use Creative Commons examples instead. So, for example, they could have used something like the Big Buck Bunny video, which I can just play right now because this is licensed under Creative Commons, so you're just free to play it, basically. Now, one thing that's been really bothering me about this is there's a lot of people who seem to be getting very angry with GitHub about this, and that is not who you should be directing your anger towards, because you can have your issues with GitHub. You can have a problem with the fact that they're acquired by Microsoft. You can have a problem with the fact that they, I don't know, change the master branch to main. All of those things are things you can have problems with. But in this case, GitHub has done literally nothing wrong. They are 100% in the right and they've done exactly what they were supposed to do. So their hands were tied by DMCA 512, which is the safe harbor clause, where basically a platform must make a reasonable attempt at removing infringing content, otherwise also be liable for damages. So in the case of, say, YouTube, what they'll typically do is they'll pass all the ad revenue to the actual owner of the content, and that basically satisfies that clause. But you can't actually do that in this case because the problem that exists here is the fact that GitHub is actually, I guess, distributing this code. So having this code available on the platform would be breaking the safe harbor clause. And GitHub has no responsibility to protect the code that exists on their platform. So if someone on GitHub violates the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that falls entirely onto the individual who owns the repo, or I guess the organization who owns the repo in the case of a company. So you can argue whether GitHub should protect the code, or whether this law should exist in the first place, but it does, and GitHub basically followed it. So they did what they were supposed to do. If you do want to have a problem with GitHub, though, there is one legitimate criticism I have seen people bringing up, and that is that GitHub is now way too big, and it is way too big of a target. So if you want to do anything that is slightly in the gray area, doing it on GitHub is a really bad idea now, because companies are starting to notice this, and more companies will start coming after code that does violate their copyright. So if you want to do anything like that, I'm not advising anyone to do anything. There are other places you can go to store code. But the thing about all of this is this doesn't actually change anything because YouTube DL still exists. Everyone who already had YouTube DL installed, they still have YouTube DL. It still exists inside of the Python repos. It still exists inside of the Ubuntu repos with apt-get. People have actually made clones and put them back up on GitHub. And because they weren't in the list of the original 18 repos to be removed, they still exist. There are repos that exist on GitLab and Gitty and just dedicated Git servers. YouTube DL still exists, but the main repo that was on GitHub, that doesn't exist. And I don't know where the developers are actually going to go. They might go to their own dedicated server and put it just somewhere that doesn't care about US law, but I'm not really sure what they're going to do. And this is basically how torrenting survives. It's very much like a cockroach. So, you know how if you, like, kill a cockroach, you're gonna have 10 more cockroaches? That's sort of what trying to pull websites down and trying to pull projects down is like. Now that all of these YouTube DL projects are gone, there are way more eyes on YouTube DL, and there's going to be a bunch of them. Like with torrenting, if, say, the Pirate Bay goes down, there's going to be 20 more Pirate Bays within the next day, and that is exactly what has happened. And unlike with GitHub, where the RIAA can go to GitHub and say, hey, GitHub, we see that you are hosting all of these versions of YouTube DL. If you have one version of YouTube DL on a bunch of different Git servers, the RIAA would have to go to each of those individually and send all of them their own DMCA takedown notices, and at some point it is not going to be worth it for the RIAA to actually do. So the Digital Millennium Copyright Act is incredibly wide-reaching, and you could probably make the argument, this is going to sound like a crazy argument, but due to the way that video streaming works, you could probably make the argument that a web browser is a DRM circumvention tool, but hopefully nobody is dumb enough to try and make that argument. Now, if you want to go and read more about all of this, there are 2 Twitter threads I'd really recommend checking out. They're by the same guy, Parker Higgins. So this first one was just a big thread basically explaining what was happening in the actual DMCA takedown notice, and this other one here is basically digging a bit more further into the law itself. So if you want to go and find a bit more about it, I really recommend reading this. So don't worry about it, YouTube DL isn't going anywhere. I actually know people personally who've said, I'm actually going to start working on the code base and start rewriting in another language, just so it's a completely different application, and give it a different name, because if it has a different name and it's a different code base, it's a completely different tool, because it's not actually very complex what YouTube DL actually is doing. So it's not very difficult to do a rewrite, but I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. There's tons of articles out there, you can go and read on it, but I didn't really think that any of them did that great of an analysis. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, but before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Chris Donald, Joachim, Corbinian, Andrew Craig, Nathan, Monster, Chico Bento, Joseph Peter, Road, Tony, Brennan, John, Marek McKell, Nate Dog, Nephite, Poe, Tees, and Zilva. If you want to go and support my work, them links down below to my Patreon, Subscribestar, LibrePay, all of that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere, and this channel is available on Odyssey, Library, and BitChute if you want to watch on a platform that isn't YouTube. So I think that's pretty much everything for me, and I'm out.